Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this new webinar from the International Energy Agency. So we are very pleased today to welcome you for a new session of this online course on energy modeling and energy statistics. So over the past few days, you have discussed with my colleague Zakia and other statistician colleagues the energy data, energy statistics, energy efficiency indicators, prices, etc. So this was more about looking at the existing data at today's situation and at the past. What we will start doing today is looking ahead at the future. So trying to develop some projections, trying to anticipate what the future could look like. But we cannot do that if we don't rely on good statistics and historical data. So those two topics, modeling and projections and historical statistics, are very much interlinked. So today we will start with an introduction of energy modeling, and over the coming days we will enter more into details of different topics. So we will today discuss all the general principles, and we will very briefly mention the different sectors of energy on demand, transformation, and supply. And tomorrow, so we will illustrate more how we can make projections on the energy demand and how energy demand could evolve in the future, while looking at the building sector as an illustration. The day after, we will discuss power sector, and after that, we'll look at hydrocarbons supply. And then next week, you will also receive some webinars by teaching partners who also do some interesting energy modeling work. So as previously, and as you know, this is a virtual event. Any question you have, please raise your hand and take the floor, or use the Q&A box. You can ask questions all along the presentation, and we will have break in the middle of the session and at the end to address all of them. So to start, I would like to invite you to go to the website www.menti.com for a few polling questions. So the code you shall use today to join this series of polling questions is 14752319. And the first question we are asking yourself is a very broad and kind of icebreaker. Is, according to you, what can be energy models useful for? Okay, excellent. We are getting some first answer. So forecasting, indeed, we'll see how energy model can help making some forecast. Policy making is, of course, the end user. We don't do modeling for the sake of modeling and of complex Excel or other software mathematical tools. It's to provide some insights to policymakers. Planning, of course, is also very much related, projecting how demand will evolve or estimating it. Energy profiling is indeed something we will look into, especially for different topics across the energy sector. But we will discuss, for example, the production profile of hydrocarbon resources, of oil wells, for example. Then I can also see recording historical data. So indeed, there are different softwares or different information system for tracking, monitoring, and recording the historical data on the one hand, and for making projections on the second hand. But of course, we cannot make projections if we don't rely on historical data. So in all our modeling tools, we will include the historical data, which are very, very important. So I see other interesting points. Maybe we'll enter into the vocabulary to clarify between projecting, estimating, forecasting, foreseeing. We'll start the course with a bit of a terminology definition. So thank you very much for your answers. Another question I like to ask you is, in your opinion, what are the main elements to be considered when developing an energy model? So here you have several proposals, and you are asked to say if you strongly disagree or strongly agree with those proposals. So we'll discuss how to build energy models, and of course, there are different elements that can be taken into consideration. What mostly weight and impact the model. So we are suggesting a few answers: the objectives, the quality of input data, the predictable political trajectories, the assumptions we are taking, or the timeliness of input data. Okay, so thank you for your answers. So, of course, for such question, there is no bad or good answer. I see that you really rate very high the model objective, which is indeed something we'll discuss. Building a tool requires to start by asking ourselves a question. What question do we want to answer with this tool? What kind of projection do we want to make? What is the scope we give ourselves for this modeling exercise? So the objective is very important, but of course, input data, assumptions are also very key, as well as political trajectories. What we will discuss is that we can analyze sensitivities and maybe try to assess different political trajectories within one modeling tools. Thanks for your answer. Another one is when we think of how energy demand will evolve in the future, one question that comes is what will be the main driver of this energy demand future evolution? So here we propose a few elements, a few drivers: technology, GDP, population, access, policies. Please vote for the driver you think will be the most important. So thanks again for your answers. So it's very interesting. Population growth is rated the highest. And indeed, as per our analysis in regions like Africa, population is really the main driver. And we expect, as you all know very well, African population to rise significantly. And population is very young, way younger than the global average, and expected to grow. And this will translate into urbanization, into higher needs for energy services. So in the case of Africa, we indeed think that that's the main driver. But for other regions in the world where population would be stable, like in Europe, GDP would be the main driver to the future energy trends. Technology development also matter everywhere, while energy access is of course a very strong driver for regions where we do not there is no yet universal access to electricity. So again, there is no good answer. This needs to be qualified depending on the region we're looking at. But in the case of Africa, if we had to maybe keep three, I would say population, then energy access and GDP as the main driver. Okay, now one more question, which is a bit more specific and relates to the exercise you might have been working on. If we want to make predictions on energy demand for the transport sector and looking only at passengers, what would be the most important variable to take into consideration in our modeling? So the Menti code is, I hope you can see on the top part of the screen, it's 14752319. Okay, so very interesting answers. The first parameter you consider is the number of cars, and indeed, this would significantly impact the demand for oil products or for any energy which is related to mobility and passenger road transportation. There are other parameters that you rate importantly. Number of passengers per car is maybe the lowest one. What we will see in the coming presentation and in the exercise is that there is one aggregated parameter we use when looking at the transport sector, and this is passenger kilometer, which is built as a combination of the three other parameters, so number of cars, average annual kilometer run by every car, and number of passenger per car. And this is usually the parameter we use to make projections and to see or to reflect the intensity of mobility from passengers. But yeah, it's built on the other one, and we can also make predictions on those different parameters independently. So thanks a lot for your answers. I'm stopping here for the Menti question and turning to the presentation. So as mentioned, we will start by looking at some general principles on energy modeling and on how to build scenarios. And then we will discuss how to make modeling and projections for energy demand. So we'll very quickly discuss the different end-use subsectors, which are industry, transport, buildings, so services and the residential sector, or agriculture. So we'll very briefly discuss those different topics. Then we will break, and in the second part, we'll discuss power sector, refineries and hydrocarbon supplies, and then we'll do the exercise. In this section, we will discuss some general principles on energy modeling and on how to build scenarios. So, as we all know, the energy sector is at the heart of our societies, and it is very linked to our climate and to our environment. There is no energy island, which means that what will happen in one country matters for the rest of the world, and what will happen in one sector has impact in other sectors. Stakeholders in the energy space are interested in understanding better the trends and the potential futures, but also to understand the possible technologies and fuel options, which each have advantages and disadvantages. So how can energy modeling and energy scenario help? Well, first, they can bring an integrated view of different key driving forces in a holistic, consistent, and disciplined way. Second, energy modeling and scenario enable to explore alternative futures and deal with uncertainties, for example, providing sensitivities analysis. And third, modeling and scenario help understanding how different technological options can meet the requirements. There is no ideal model. A model is a tool which is built to answer a specific answer. So each model has strengths and weaknesses. At the IEA, our models are deeply rooted into techno-economic assessment, and we will present in the coming slides more details on our energy models. We need to define our approach towards the future and to discuss a bit terminology. So when we consider the future, we can try to predict what will happen in any case, but this is about prophecy. What we do under energy modeling is to try to predict what happens if some conditions are met, and then we are exploring scenario, we are forecasting and foreseeing, but we can also try to investigate what should happen for a certain objective to be met. For example, if we want universal access to clean cooking and electricity to be reached by 2030, what would be the optimum trajectory by that date? When we design energy models, we need first to ask ourselves what is the objective of this model, what is its scope, and what will be its different features. And as a start, looking at historical data is fundamental because the level of details available will define how reliable and accurate the model will be. Then there are questions on coverage, what sector, what geographical areas, what type of fuels we want to take into account in the energy model. In terms of approach and techniques, there are different. We will present them in the coming slides. We can also integrate specific features like endogenous technological learning, where, for example, we will say that the cost of a given technology, for example, solar PV, would decrease over time as the deployment of this technology increases. We can also include macroeconomic feedback, for example, in an oil producer country, if we take assumptions on the exports of oil, this might have impact on the GDP of the country. And GDP is usually an input information, as we will discuss later on. So this can impact the entire energy model. But the design of the model will very much rely on drawing a line between what is exogenous and what is endogenous. And we will never insist enough on that. Data requirements will totally depend on the model design and will strongly impact the model. We cannot do projection, we cannot look at the future if we don't have statistics and data that enable us to understand the present and to understand the past and where we come from. How can we make projections on the future of energy demand? There are two main methodologies, and the first approach is on end use. It's a bottom-up or an engineering approach. Here, the idea is to use a physical relationship between energy and the end-use devices, the processes, the services. Let's take an example. If we want to estimate what will be the demand for electricity in the residential sector in 10 years, we could disaggregate the residential sector, look at each and every need household would have. For example, there is a need for lighting, for cooking, for powering some appliances. So we would look sector by sector, what are the needs, what is the final energy demand, what are the devices that will provide those services. So there would be different type of lighting bulbs, LEDs, what will be the consumption of each of those devices, and we will be able to get a number of the electricity demand for this sector. So this approach is highly disaggregated and it enables very precise analysis. Although it's complex and data consuming, it is very appropriate for the midterm and the long term. Another approach for estimating future energy demand is to look at econometric established relations, for example, between energy demand and economic variables. Again, if we want to estimate the future electricity demand in the residential sector, we could try to look what is the level today and to see how it's linked to the GDP per capita. And if we look at the evolution of the GDP per capita, we could try to estimate what will be the evolution of electricity demand. And this will be based on established relationships between those two variables based in the past, based in other regions and comparable countries. So this type of approach is made at a very aggregated level. It's not made at the end use level, so it's simpler, but it is less accurate. This approach is very appropriate for the short term. When we want to project and to estimate what the future of energy supply could be, again, there are two methodologies. The first one is about optimization. We ensure minimizing a variable under like cost and ensuring that it meets all the constraints. So it can be having a level of electricity produced at the lower cost, having an electricity mix at the lower emission factor. Another methodology is about simulation, where we will simulate behaviors of both energy consumers and energy producers. For example, we will take one signal that would be price of the oil barrel, and see, depending on the price, how much oil consumer will ask for and how much oil producer would be able to bring to the market. And then you do iterations to find an equilibrium between consumption and production. On this slide, we are trying to recap a mapping of those different energy models and approaches. So as we said, you can be under a deductive approach and do some forecasting. So what the future is likely to look like given a set of assumptions. So if we have these policies, if we continue with this type of technology, what will the future look like? And on the right end of the slide, you can see another approach, which is strategic planning. So this is a normative methodology where we will set an objective, universal access to electricity, reduction of CO2 emissions as per our climate agreement, and we will try to deduct and backcast what would be the pathway to get there. Then, in terms of modeling methodology, as we say, there are bottom-up methodologies and top-down. There are many different models and existing tools to do energy modeling. At the IEA, we use what we call the World Energy Model that we will present into more details. Energy modeling relies on scenario. And to build a scenario, it is needed to develop sets of policies that will describe different future pathways. Creating a coherent storyline among policy, prices, deployment, and development of energy sources and technologies are important, and it is needed to ensure that all that makes sense together. At the International Energy Agency, the flagship publication World Energy Outlook relies on two main scenarios. The first one is the stated policy scenario, or STEPS, which holds up a mirror to the actions and the intentions of today's policymakers. In other words, it is a deductive approach where we provide a candid assessment of what would happen if those policy actions and intentions are implemented, and what will be the implication for energy markets, for energy security, for emissions. Another scenario, which comes from a normative approach, is the sustainable development scenario. It provides a strategic pathway to meet global climate goals, air quality, and energy access in full. So here the idea is to say what shall be the pathway if we want to have universal access by 2030, if we want to be aligned with our climate and air quality goals. But we can also develop ad hoc analyses, cases, sensitivities, and in the case of Africa, in 2019, the World Energy Outlook presented the Africa case, which includes as targets the Agenda 2063 of Africa Union goals for inclusive and sustainable socioeconomic growth, in addition to universal access to both electricity and clean cooking, and to improvement of air quality. This is a simplified chart of the International Energy Agency World Energy Model, or WEM, and we will come to this slide many times in the coming sessions and the coming trainings. You can see on the top part of the chart some green arrows, which are the input assumptions. On the bottom part, you have the output with orange arrows, including energy flows, so the energy balances, associated CO2 emissions, and investment required to have those energy systems. And the heart of the modeling, of the energy modeling tool itself, is broken down into different subsections. So going from the right to the left, on the right we have the final energy demand sectors, industry, transport, buildings, agriculture, and we will look at the services which require energy and the end use demand. Left to that, we will deduct the transformation processes, refinery, power sector, and the primary energy demand related to that. So oil, oil demand, coal, gas, but also resources for power generation. On the top left side, you have the supply modeling section with fossil fuel supply, but very importantly as well, trade matrices, import, export of oil, of gas, as well as domestic production. And the fossil fuel prices will play a role of equilibrium between supply and demand. Developing models requires to take assumptions. And at the IEA, our modeling exercises rely on various set of data, including IEA internal statistics and research, as well as external data available. When it comes to cost, it is very important to have regular peer review of the hypothesis because cost can evolve very, very quickly and be outdated very, very quickly. At the IEA, all our main assumptions are made publicly available and transparent in our website and in our publication. And what ensures the robustness and the seriousness of our work is that each and every report is peer reviewed by many experts from different sectors, from different sources and regions. In the model, the input includes exogenous assumptions. And those assumptions are related to socioeconomic drivers, like how population will evolve in the future, how GDP is to evolve. So we can rely on other institutions' predictions, like IMF, or make our own predictions. Then we will take as exogenous assumption the policies that government would take, for example, energy policies in the renewable space with targets that could be fixed by government, with standards that would be implemented or support measure to certain energy technologies, energy access targets, subsidies, removal rates that will also help the assumption and be input to the model. Technology assumptions are key as well, including investment, efficiency of the technology, cost of the capital for deploying those technologies, as well as assumptions on infrastructure development. How long does it take to develop a hydropower dam, for example? In this section, we will present energy demand modeling, starting with general principles and then illustrating with industry, transport, and building sectors. Coming back to our simplified chart of the world energy model, we are on the right part, so looking at final energy demand that will enable us to understand transformation processes in the second step. So what do we want to do in the demand side modeling modules of the world energy outlook? We are building on a bottom-up modeling of the energy sector, and this is done for 25 regions of the world, encompassing power, heat, and other transformation, and looking at the final sectors, which are industry, transport, buildings, and others. The objective is to get an explicit idea of the sector and the technology specific parameters, which would be specific to each region and country as well. We want to know about stocks of equipments, future capacities and future sales of such equipment, lifetime of each unity, each equipment, cost and related efficiencies. And this applies to the car fleet in a country, but also to the power plant, where we'd like to understand again stock, future capacity, and features of each of those plants. Each and every module of the demand modeling are structured in the same way. The question we want to answer is what will be the final energy demand coming from transport, from industry, from agriculture? And to answer this question, we need to ask ourselves what is the real demand for energy services? So, what is the requested useful energy? And what will be the technologies, the fuels, the equipment that will meet these, that will provide these services? Sometimes it's not easy to have estimation of how the demand for energy services will evolve. So we need to define some drivers to make those estimations. So let's take an example on residential sector. If we want to estimate how the demand for electricity in the residential sector will evolve, we can look at one specific topic that would be lighting. And the question is, how will households want to get lighting services in the future? We may know what is the demand today for electricity for lighting houses, but we don't know very well how this will evolve. So we can try, based on econometric analysis, to estimate this. And a driver that could be a good indication of lighting services could be the square meters per capita. And here, again, based on econometric analysis, we can try to project how the square meter per capita will evolve in a certain country, maybe function of the GDP per capita, and assuming that we know how the GDP per capita is projected to evolve based on projections from socioeconomic analysis, we can estimate how the square meter per capita will evolve. And then, based on what we observed in the past, what we observe in similar countries, we can estimate how the demand for lighting will evolve for all those houses, for all those meters per capita. From there, we'll be able to anticipate how demand for lighting will increase and to understand what is the part of this demand which is provided by existing technologies, how those equipments like the existing light bulbs will last, and there will be a retirement of those old technologies. So if we want to meet the new demand, we have a need for new equipments, and based on a cost-based approach, we will be estimating what type of technology will be deployed. For example, for the lighting need, we could have super efficient LED as well as more basic light bulbs. And based on economic analysis, we can estimate what will be the share of super efficient LED that will be bought by people and what will be the share of more basic lighting bulbs. Each of those technology, so this diverse portfolio of technology has for each different efficiency levels. So we will be able to convert this need for useful energy into a need for final energy based on the efficiency of each equipment. Different strategies will be implied for different sectors. Here, if we look at the sustainable development scenario, we can see how total final consumption would evolve by sector and by fuel. And we can see that in the transport sector, there is a sharp decline in the total final consumption that also leads to a decline in the CO2 emissions. But we don't have such evolution in industry and buildings. One reason that would be that due to the expansion of electricity access, the total final consumption in building is not decreasing. So in each end use sector module, the questions we want to answer is what will be the need for new equipments in the future? And this requires to ask the first question, which is what is the end use demand in the future? Then how much equipment needs to be replaced, how much new equipment we will need. And to do that, we are asking ourselves which are the technologies chosen to meet the estimated end use demand, and what is the influence of energy policies. In our case of lighting, we could try to estimate what if the government uh, puts standards which provide from importing very basic lighting bulbs, but really supports the deployment of super efficient LED. This would have an impact in our exercise of allocating the different technologies to meet the end use needs. And another question we want to answer is what will be the associated and the resulting final energy demand and the associated CO2 emissions and investment. Now we will very quickly illustrate this on the industry sector. So the industry demand model is disaggregated per sector. So we will have different industrial sector, aluminium, cement, etc. And in our model, we will, as usual, have as inputs socioeconomic drivers like GDP, population, but also historic production of industry products and end-use energy prices. In terms of activity variable, we will take into consideration physical production. So if we want to estimate the future energy demand from the cement industry, we might take as a variable the tons of cement which will be produced in the future and deduct from the tons of cement what would be the energy demand. For some sectors where we don't have a physical production, we can look at the value added of this specific industry. This is an example of results that we can get in our analysis looking at Africa industry. Here you can see 4 countries with 2018 levels of demand on cement and on steel in 2018 and in 2040, according to our projections. And we have also compared these levels to those of India in 2018. So steel and cement demand per capita is one example of parameter we will project so that we get a better understanding of what could be the total energy demand coming from the industry. And the interesting part of the analysis is that we are able also to look at what would be the share of imports and the share of domestic production. Another analysis that we are bringing to your attention in the industry sector is about motors, because most of the energy demand in the industry sector comes from motor-driven system, and this is where efficiency matters a lot, because there is a high potential with efficiency measures to decrease the energy demand in the industry sector, looking at the efficiency of motors. Moving to the transport sector. So when it comes to transport, we again need to disaggregate. So we know that there is transport on roads, aviation, rail, navigation. So this will be our disaggregated subsectors. And we will look for activity variables that will depend on whether we're looking at passengers or goods. As usual, we have social economic indicators as input of the model, including population, GDP, and historical data. So as discussed, the activity variable we will rely on are passenger kilometers, which is basically an aggregated indicator of vehicle fleet, distance traveled on average by one car, and occupation rates, or number of people in one car. And this number will be a good indication of the intensity of how much people want to travel on the road with cars. We will have the same type of indicator with goods on ton kilometers, where we will multiply vehicle fleet by distance traveled by load factor or quantity of good in the trucks. Again, if we look at one analysis we have done on the future of Africa transport, we can focus on evolution of vehicle ownership, and here we have made projections on the level of cars and two and three wheelers owned by thousands of people in Africa. The key message is that it is expected to grow very fast, to grow further in the Africa case scenario. And you have countries like Ghana, where the number of two and three wheelers per thousand people is expected to triple. We also need to remember that this is per thousand people and the population itself will grow. So there is expectation of much more cars, much more two, three wheelers in the roads in Africa in the coming decades. Another result of our outlook exercise on the Africa transport is based on evolution of the car fleet, based on evolution of passenger kilometers indicators, of ton kilometers indicators. We can have an estimation on how total energy demand for the transport sector will evolve. So starting in 2018, we see that there is a breakdown where road passenger makes the bulk of the energy demand. By 2030, this is expected to grow, and the difference between our stated policy scenario and the Africa case is due to a higher GDP. That means more economic development, more cars in the roads, more trucks in the roads. Looking ahead to 2040, we can see that higher GDP again increases the demand for transport, but efficiency gain contributes to limit the growth. So again, there is a strong case for efficiency measures that can limit the growth of economic of energy demand. Looking now at the building sector. So building is an aggregation of residential and services sector, where again we will have to segment and disaggregate by the type of energy need we are looking at. So we know that in buildings, we are looking for space cooling, water heating, we are looking for energy for cooking, for lighting, for powering appliances. Here, the activity variables we will look at are floor space, so square meter per capita, number of households, appliances ownership, how many TV or how many phones does a household have on average, and we can also rely on services added value. As usual, our input data will be socioeconomic drivers, but also building specific indicators like urbanization or dwelling occupancy. One result at a global level is that under the stated policy scenario, we see that there would be an increase of almost all fuels to meet the needs in buildings because buildings are requiring electricity for lighting, for example, but also oil products, LPG for cooking, for instance, but it can also be heat, gas for cooking, etc. We can see that this is a totally different story if we are under our sustainable development scenario at the global level, where CO2 emissions coming from the building sector are expected to decrease, and we will see an increasing share of electricity as the main fuel providing the energy services for the building sector. One key analysis specific to Africa about cooling. As you may know, today there are 700 million people who need cooling services in Africa today because they live in places where the average temperature every day does never go below 25 degrees. In 2040, this number will rise to 1.2 billion because of population growth and because of global warming. Today, the equipment in air conditioner, fans is very low, but with middle class rising and with population growth and urbanization, we expect that the demand for cooling services will increase a lot by 2040, and this will translate into a demand for electricity in the building sector. Still, if some efficiency measures are implemented, there is a potential to divide by two this increase in the electricity demand. For example, implementing standards to import the most advanced air conditioner and the most efficient fans. Okay, so we come back to the presentation and we will take some time for Q&A. And thank you very much, Zakia, for joining us for the Q&A part. So there are a few questions on energy efficiency. Maybe I can start, Zakia, and then hand over the floor to you. So the questions are about is there a model for energy efficiency long-term projections? And maybe as you have seen in the simplified view of the world energy model, we have a module for each subsector. We have module per type of fuels, but you have not seen any module for energy efficiency. And the reason for that is that energy efficiency is everywhere. This is something our executive director used to say to policymakers, is that not all countries have oil, not all countries have the same solar irradiation resources, but there is one energy that everyone on Earth has, and this resource is energy efficiency. And by that, what we mean is that energy efficiencies is about measures, policies that can be taken all across the energy sectors. So as you may have seen in the presentation, we discuss energy efficiency as for any any topic and any modeling exercise we do. So when we discussed the building sector, we saw that there is energy efficiency for reducing cooling needs with higher efficient appliances. We see the same in the transport sector. We see the same in the industry sector. So energy efficiency is really something transversal that we will work on at each and every step of the modeling exercise whenever we start making projections and whenever we look at the portfolio of technologies, of equipments, of plants that will be providing energy services. So this is more on the projection and how do we take into account energy efficiency. And Zakia, I give you the floor if you want to enter more into the data collection.
Thanks, Arnaud. I think on energy efficiency, one thing that we use a lot is the decomposition analysis. In the WEO, we do a decomposition analysis where we try to decompose the energy consumption of an economy on its activity, efficiency, structural changes, and climate and other factors. So then you can track really the actual efficient evolution of the different products and technologies. If we go back to the first question, it was about how does one effectively use the end-use approach to collect data on energy efficiency. So here I would say that you need to collect detailed energy consumption data, but also the related activity data. For example, space heating consumption and floor area. And you also need to select the most appropriate activity data. And in this case, floor area, it's better than occupied dwellings. And also, if possible, you have to correct for climate. So the idea is differently from the energy intensity. Here, we want to isolate the energy efficiency factor. I hope I have been clear on this one. Let me know if you want to elaborate more. Maybe, Arnaud, you can take over the next question.
Thank you, Zakia. So we had two questions on explaining more the world energy model. Maybe just to mention that when someone is asking a question and you like it or you have the same, what you can just do is like the question so we can see and it's rating higher. So I can quickly elaborate more on the world energy model overview. So here you can see on the screen the schematic we have done. But basically, this is mostly about a disaggregation of the energy sector. So if you look inside the box, you will see the different end-use sectors and their related services. So for example, the residential sector, we will have its related energy service demand drivers like household size, floor space. And basically what we do is, as this is a bottom-up approach, we start from the end use to understand what the energy service need are, how that translate into a need for a certain type of energy, like how much electricity is needed by households for lighting, how much oil would be needed by households for backup generator, for example. And we will do that for each subsector of end use so that we can come with an aggregated energy demand fuel by fuel. We know that we need some transformation to go from primary energy demand to final energy demand. So for example, refineries will produce different type of oil products. Some will be for transport, others will be for industry, others will be for households. And this demand of different type of fuels will also come from primary energy, and this is why we're doing it bottom up demand to supply. And then in terms of the schematic of the model, we just put with arrows some input assumptions to the model that would be our socioeconomic drivers. And we put at the bottom the outputs, which are, once we have done this modeling exercise, what results do we get? So we will get the energy flows year by year by 2050, for example. We will know the associated CO2 emissions, etc., etc. I hope this answers the questions on the WEM overview, but we will really take this this schematic step by step as we move deeper into the discussion and we illustrate more of the sectors. So a question still on the bottom up and top down approach. So I think that there was one slide presenting the differences and advantages and limits of each. Maybe to summarize, bottom up is to estimate energy demand. Bottom up is more accurate and very well suited for long-term projections, but is data consuming. It requires a lot of disaggregation and it takes a lot of time. Whereas top down is faster, is based on established relations between socioeconomic drivers observed in other countries, observed in the past. So it can be way faster to make such exercise. It's more fitted for the short term. This would be the major differences. Okay, so if there is no other question, so there is one. Did you validate the world model? Maybe if you can elaborate a bit on the question so that we can answer more specifically. I'm not sure I understand in the way it's put. But as we said, we got validation or review from many experts of the assumption of the model, of the way we make the projections. So this is a way of making it more robust and to ensure it's adapted. So before moving to the second part of the training, I'd like to maybe ask a bit more questions. So I invite you to go back to Menti. Still using the same code, you will see a new set of questions coming. So the first one is, in case you have already been using some modeling or projection tools, could you just mention them, please, so that we have a better, a bit more understanding of the type of modeling tools you've been using? Okay, so thank you for your answer. I see a few models which are specific to certain sectors like power factory. You are also several mentioning Excel, and indeed, Excel can really is already powerful enough to do a lot of exercises. So what we will do under this training is just to work under Excel. And of course, there are many other tools that we will be happy to discuss with you. I think, again, the tool depends on the question you want to answer, and there is no perfect tool. There are just different models, different tools that can help you in a specific exercise. But thanks for your inputs. Another one, looking at the time frame, when you do modeling, what is the time horizon that you usually look at? So is it below 5 years, 5 to 10 years outlook, 10 to 20 years outlook, or above 20 years? Okay, so interestingly enough, we have people looking at different time horizons. Again, there are different tools, and some might be best fitted to look at the very short term, whereas others will be better for looking at longer term perspective. What we will be able to discuss with you as well is that within the IEA, we have different departments, different teams. Some are doing some below 5 years projection, and they are using series of assumptions. They are relying on different hypotheses. Whereas for publication like the World Energy Outlook and the World Energy Model, where we do long-term projections, like 20 years, we usually have different sets of assumptions and a different modeling approach. So that's interesting to see that within this group, we have quite a diverse group in terms of time horizon. Okay, so thanks for sharing your practices in Zambia. And the last one is, according to you, when we do a modeling exercise, what are energy prices useful for? How will we use energy prices in our prediction, in building our modeling? In this section, we will present the energy modeling for the power sector and the refineries. So very interesting answers. For most of you, it's used as a balance between supply and demand. And this is indeed what we do in our modeling exercise. There are other ways of doing it, but at the IEA on the modeling, we use price as an equilibrium point between supply and demand, as we will discuss more in the next session. But prices are also very useful indeed to see the impact on services demanded by households, because depending if it's affordable or not, we will not get the same level of demand. And prices are also very important for trade and investment, as you rightly answered. So thank you very much for your answers on Menti. And now we'll come back to presenting power sector transformation, refineries, as well as hydrocarbons supply. In this section, we will present the energy modeling for the power sector and the refineries, so for transformation processes. In our world energy model simplified charts, so we are at the central part looking at transformation for power generation, which is often associated with heat production, and looking at refinery. Power sector is very complex, and we will present more into details this slide in a dedicated sessions on modeling of power sector. But the two main questions we want to answer, looking at the future of the power sector, is what will be the new plants we need to add? And this is based on the existing stock of power plants and how they will evolve, when they will be retired, and with the increase of the demand, so based on investment assumptions, on refurbishment of existing plants, we will be able to estimate what will be the need for new plants to be added. And the second quick key question we need to ask is what will be the merit order dispatch? So in other words, how we will be able to meet at each second energy demand and to have a match between electricity demand and electricity supply by operating the right plants in a power mix where we would have solar PV producing during the day and base load power plants that would be also available in the day, but also at the peak of the demand in the night. The question is, when do we need to give priority to this or that technology based on different factors that would be cost, that would be CO2, etc. When it comes to integrating renewables into the electricity mix, there is some modeling to be done as well, looking at the potential of renewable energies, solar PV, wind, etc., and looking at the cost as well. So this will enable us to have a calculation on deployment of renewable energy and to estimate the needs for investment. What we observe is that decreasing cost and policy support are really bringing down the cost of renewables and are really bringing higher and higher the shares of renewable in most countries with important competitiveness. Let's have a look at one result of our modeling exercise on the African power sector, where on the left part you can see demand for electricity in Africa, and on the right part you can see how this demand is supplied, is provided by the electricity generation sources. So today, most of the electricity demanded in Africa is for productive uses, industry, agriculture, and there is also a significant part for households, and it's provided by sources which are gas, solar PV, hydro, and other sources for electricity generation. Based on our modeling, which comes from the demand sector, so how will evolve the demand in the building sector, in the industry sector, in the transport sector, we will have estimation of the future need for electricity. And here you can see that there is an important increase of productive electricity for productive uses for households which are already connected to the electricity today and that will have more appliances or more electricity needs, but also there will be a new demand from households who are not connected today and who will gain access to electricity. And the mix for generating this electricity will also evolve with an important role for gas, but the big winners will be modern renewables, specifically solar PV, who is expected to grow very fast. Another module into the transformation step of our world energy model is the refining model. And this model is really the link between oil demand. So, for example, demand for oil products in transport, gasoline, diesel, other LPG, and other products, and oil supply that will be crude oil, and refining is the intermediate between the two. So we will have to look, as we always do, at the demand category of product per category, kerosene, LPG, gasoline, etc. We will have to look at the demand for refined product, how those refineries are operated, what are the runs of those refineries, and then as there is a lot of trade for oil products and for crude oil, we will have to balance region per region how the exchanges will happen between local and domestic production, import, exports from different regions. So if you try to look at what the results of our outlook would be for the oil sector, we can see that we expect oil production, so crude oil production in Africa, to be stable, while demand for oil, which derives from demand from oil products, is expected to increase. So considering the evolution of refinery runs, so how much crude oil will be converted into oil products, we can deduct what will be the expected net product imports, and this gives a very good indication of dependency on imports. In this section, we will describe energy modeling for the supply side. Coming back to our simplified chart of the world energy model, we are now looking at the left part, the supply of energy model, and we will see that fossil fuel prices have a key role. So the fossil fuel supply models are typically containing three models: oil, natural gas, and coal, even though oil and gas model are interlinked via natural gas liquids. The oil supply model is at a global level where supply and demand are in balance, whereas natural gas and coal, which are usually more domestically or regionally traded energies, are considered at regional level. For in the case of natural gas, there are some infrastructure which are like pipelines that determine where a certain production will be consumed, but we observe with LNG that natural gas is increasingly a global resource. To run those fossil fuel supply modules, there are many iterations between supply and demand, and price play a key role. And as you will see, there are different typologies and types of oil and gas. So prices play a key role of equilibrium in the world energy model because it is based on the idea that fossil fuel prices reflect levels which are sufficient for investment, but also to meet demand. So prices are at a level that makes that consumers can afford getting those resources, but at a level which is high enough that producer, so countries, companies, and investors can actually produce this resource and have economic return on their investment. So in this exercise, prices are derived through iterative modeling, and their trajectories are smooth and linear, even though we know that in reality, prices of oil, for example, are very, very volatile. We could have a more volatile and a less smooth trajectory, but this is not the goal of this modeling exercise where we want to have long-term trajectories. For example, if we look at different projections of the price of crude oil, we see that under current policy or stated policy scenario, there is an increase of the price of oil barrel. And the main idea is that under the scenario, demand for oil is expected to grow, so the resources to be developed will be more and more costly. So this will be reflected in the price proposed by producers to consumers. In the case of the sustainable development scenario, we expect a decrease in demand for oil products. So there is also derived from that an expectation that the cost of production of the resource developed will be the lowest one, and on average, the crude oil price is expected to decline. One key specificity to the oil and gas sector is that, contrary to the power sector, you cannot switch on and switch off plant upon request. When you have an existing field producing oil or producing gas, this specific field has a profile of production. And if we look today at how the supply and the production of oil meets the demand. And if we look in the future, we can see that under our stated policy demand scenario, we expect demand for oil to increase slightly or remain stable. But the existing production of fields which are exploited today is to decrease naturally. So if we want to fill the gap and to continue meeting the demand, we need to invest in new fields. So one new investment will bring to the market additional resource, but this field will decrease over time. And this will be the case for all new fields. So there is a need to invest and to invest continuously to ensure that there is a match between demand and existing production. So there are calculations which are made at regional level to ensure that there is a match between demand for crude oil, refining capacity, and demand for oil products. Looking at one key output for Africa, here you can see the net income that can be made from oil and gas resources in the top 10 producers in the continent. What is striking is that there has been a high volatility of incomes over the last 2 decades, and if you link this to government expenditure, you can see that when the revenues went up, government expenditure went up at a rapid pace, but in case of decrease, it was more difficult for governments to decrease their expenditure. What can the future look like? So again, we need to make assumptions, to make different scenario. Under a stated policy scenario we did last year, we would expect to see, based on the prices and the levels of production, that the top 10 producers in Africa could go back to levels of revenues which are the average of the last decade. But under another scenario of faster energy transition, there would be less demand for oil and gas products, and then there might be less revenues for the key producers. To conclude, energy models are a framework which provide or enable analysis, but it is a simplified representation of the real world. And the level of detail, the level of accuracy of the model will depend on what question we want to answer and what are the data available. Energy systems modeling provide many inputs. It can provide an outline for different possible directions where the energy system would go depending on assumptions. It gives high-level examples of prices, consumption, emissions, and it can give to policymakers cost estimates. But it is a long-term and a continuous process. It involves expertise from many different disciplines, and it's mostly a framework to help think about the challenges which are faced by energy systems and the decisions that needs to be taken by policymakers. It is not about predicting the future, it's really about supporting decision making under uncertainties, under different assumptions. So we will now take a new series of questions before we look into the Excel exercise. So there are very interesting questions from Mr. Joshua Kumbusho-Nyoni. Maybe first one is on the question is, do you factor in the market competitiveness in different regions in deriving or predicting prices? So maybe here when we say price is an element of the modeling exercise, it also depends on where we are in the energy system. In the example of hydrocarbons, as you have seen, it will depend on the fuel. For oil, there are some oil is a global market, so we will use the global prices, looking at the oil barrel of the different. Well, there are a few different, but it's mostly global. So we'll take the global price. Whereas for coal markets, they are much more regional. So we look region per region at the prices, And per region, the prices are also, they are reflecting market competitiveness. So this is one example to say it's just highly dependent on the fuel or the type of energy you are looking at. Another question Mr. Joshua asked is about the way we make some country level modeling. So the question is, when you prepare the stats and model for a country, do you engage the specific company to validate and confirm if it tallies with expectation? So maybe here to detail a bit more how the IEA is doing its modeling exercise, what we usually do is that we do some projection and modeling for the world as a whole and for different subregions. So in our model, we have 25 subregions. Sometimes a region is a country, like the US, like China, like India. It's also the case for South Africa. But in many other cases, a region is an aggregation of specific countries, for example, North Africa. That being said, we usually do a lot of ad hoc analysis and we do some modeling exercises for specific countries. So in the case of Africa, we have developed under the Africa Energy Outlook in 2019 individual modelings for 11 countries. Unfortunately, Zambia was not one of them, but still we have some interesting projections at the regional level. And we, under this program that we will work on together for the coming months and years, we'll be very happy to work together on developing projections and supporting the use of modeling tools for the specific case of Zambia. So that was on the country level modeling. Another question is on the assumptions and the different scenarios. So the question is, what are the main differences in assumptions in the current stated and SDG policies in modeling alternative futures? And then are there global or country-specific aligned with national determined contribution NDCs for the case with SDGs? So very interesting question, thank you. So as we mentioned, we have different scenarios, and each scenario is a current storyline with its own assumption. One scenario is what we call the steps, the stated policies, which takes into account announced policies by the government. So this would include the NDCs when it comes to their climate targets and the related CO2 emissions for the energy sector. And we also have other type of scenario like the sustainable development scenario, where the idea is to backcast from a target of having a certain level of CO2 emissions in order to be aligned with the Paris Agreement of limiting global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. We also have scenarios that take into account the SDG universal energy access targets by 2030. So depending on the scenario, we'll take those different assumptions. But the idea is that we really we are trying to monitor policies of each countries to see what is the current trend line, so that to take into account into our stated policies. And we also look at what would the trajectory need to be if we want to reach certain objectives under different scenarios. And maybe to mention also that we are increasingly working on the relations between energy and CO2 emissions. This year is a very specific year with the COP26, where the IEA is very much committed with the UK presidency to help countries develop net zero trajectories, so that the world and all the countries are aligned with the Paris Agreement and the target of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees and to reaching net zero emissions by 2050. We will have a report published very soon with those trajectories, looking at all the implications for the end-use sectors, looking at all the technological and behavior implications for all regions of the world. And we'll be very happy to share the findings of the report with you as soon as it's available. It will be out in a bit less than 1 month. Another question on has COVID-19 impacted the different scenarios in predicted energy? Yes, it has very much impacted. We have presented the latest World Energy Outlook 2020 with specific scenarios related to COVID-19. So looking at how the GDP would evolve based on predictions made with the International Monetary Fund, but we also developed specific scenarios and sensitivities. If taking into account that these economic projections might be too optimistic, what if the pandemic lasts longer? What if the scarces of this pandemic are deeper in our societies, reflecting in lower economic development, reflecting into lower energy demand? So we have this type of scenarios in the latest World Energy Outlook 2020. And if you go to the playlist of what we call the monthly IEA Africa University, we have presented this analysis in January, so you can find again those predictions. Okay, I'm looking at more questions. So there is again one question on the World Energy Model overview. There will be on Friday a specific session to discuss the power sector and how this is related, how it fits into the overview. So I won't take the question now because a colleague who is really expert on power sector will elaborate much more and much better than I would do on how the power sector is interlinked between the end use demand and supply. But in two words, as you would know, there is demand for electricity from households, from services, from industries, from transport. So we look at all those end-use sectors. We see what the need for electricity is. We of course take into consideration transmission and distribution losses, own use of the electric sector, and then we have our need for electricity produced, and this was from the demand, and we look, of course, at the supply. What are the different sources to create this electricity? As you all know, for electricity, you need to have a perfect match, hour per hour of whatever electricity is demanded. You need to provide it and to inject into the network and the grid at the same time. But we'll enter more into details on Friday about it. And there is also another very interesting question on oil and the way we use on the way oil fields produce their outputs and their barrels. I would like to keep this question also for next Monday, since we'll have a dedicated session on hydrocarbons and on the modeling of supply side. So I'm keeping it, and please ask again your question on Monday. We will have a colleague which is really very expert on those questions. So now I suggest to quickly look at the exercise that we sent to you in advance, and which aims at really starting to play on this modeling exercise, on this modeling approach. Okay, so you shall be able to see my Excel screen. So here the exercise was about really a super simplified model on the transport sector, and the aim was to see, can we anticipate what the demand for oil products for transport will be in the future, and what will be the impact on the supply side. So how at what level shall refineries run, and whatever oil products which are not produced in the refineries of the countries, we would need to import the remainders. So what will be the level of import dependency based on those projections? So I'll go question by question, but as you have seen in the Excel, this is built with several parameters, and looking at the columns, we have historical data and then projections. And I will never stress enough that we are building all our projections on historical data. So if we don't have reliable statistics, if we don't understand where we come from and where we are today, it's not possible, or it's very complex to make reliable and trustful projections. So we have a few information in this exercise. We know socioeconomic drivers like population, and we know how this is to evolve in the future. This could come, for example, from UN population predictions. We have information on the oil sector, like the total demand of oil products for road transport. We also know the number of cars in the countries. We have some specific variables of the transport sector that we discussed, like the average distance traveled by each car, the average number of people that we have in one car, which is the occupancy rate. And now we also have some information on the transformation processes with the refinery outputs and the imports of gasoline. So with the first question, we'll try to look at the historical data and to get a better understanding of today's situation. And the first question was to calculate the passenger kilometer variable, which, as we mentioned, is an aggregated way to understand a bit the intensity of mobility from personal passenger cars. And as we say, this is built by multiplying the number of car in the country by the average distance traveled per car and by the number of people in each car. So you just need to be careful with the units because we have millions kilometers, and then you are asked to provide a number in billion kilometers. And we can see that this indicator has increased significantly between the year 2000 and the year 2018. Question 2 was to try to understand a bit better what has been the efficiency level of these cars of passenger transport. And what we'll aim to calculate is the average fuel consumption per 100 kilometer per car. And this can be deducted because we know what is the total oil demand for oil products in the country. And we know what has been the number of kilometers traveled by all the cars in the country. So we can first calculate it using the units we are given, which are tons of oil equivalents, but then we can convert it into liters per kilometers, which is something we are more used to in the transport sector. And the result is that when we compare the year 2000 to the year 2018 values, we see in our with our data that the efficiency level has increased because on average, a car is consuming now 11 liters to run, to travel 100 kilometers, whereas it was consuming 13 liters per 100 kilometers in the year 2000. Okay, so now that we have this better information on the past situation, we can start looking ahead. And the first thing we like to know is how the number of cars in the country could evolve, because this will be a driver for oil products demand. And here, we cannot invent a number out of our head. We need to make assumptions, and you are given certain assumptions here, like, okay, let's assume that on average, the cars will travel a bit more than they do today, and that it will increase every year by 50 kilometers. Then let's assume that the occupancy rate, so the number of people in cars, will remain at the same level as it is today. And last, there was an assumption on this aggregated parameter, which is passenger kilometer. And we took the assumption that it will increase every year by 7%. These are assumptions, and we write the parameters in this column so that we can change them and play with them and see the impact when we'll do some sensitivities analysis. And so basically here we are making the calculation based on historical data and on the growth rate or the increment we defined. And once we have projected those parameters, we can deduct the future car stock since, as we did for the first question, passenger kilometer is made of those three parameters: kilometers traveled per car, occupancy rate, and total car stock. So according to the hypothesis we took, the number of car would go from 340 in today to 700,000 in 2030. So almost a doubling of the number of cars in the roads. So once we know that, we can ask ourselves, okay, we know how the car fleet shall evolve. What would be the subsequent demand for oil products in the future? And here again, the assumption we'll take is on the efficiency level of each car. So we have calculated what is the average fuel consumption per 100 kilometer per car. We will assume that this level of consumption will improve every year, meaning that it will decrease because motors will be more efficient, cars will consume less and less, and we assume it will improve by 1% every year. So once we know the future average fuel consumption per car, we can deduct the total oil demand as we have all the other parameters, which are the number of kilometers traveled per car and the total number of cars. And here again, we can see that we expect a doubling of the total oil demand under those scenarios. So this was on the demand side. If we look at the supply, so that this demand is actually met, so we have taken the hypothesis that there are some refineries in the countries. They have some historical level of production, and we can assume that in the future, refinery activities will increase, and we say it will increase by 2% every year. So here we can calculate how the refinery outputs will evolve. And since we know the demand for oil and we know for oil products, and we know the oil products produced by the refineries in the countries, we can deduct that all the remainders which needs to be imported to match the demand. And here again, we see under this exercise a significant increase in the imports of gasoline, and we can calculate what the import dependency, so how much of the oil consumed in the country for cars is imported versus what is coming from the local refineries. And we see that in the past, this import dependency was stable at 50%, and under our exercise, it's increasing to 70%. So then what's interesting, as we said, is to make some analysis and to try to do some sensitivities analysis. So we have made a series of figures to see a bit better our projections. On the first chart, you would see how our passenger kilometer parameter is to evolve in the future, and this translates into an increase in oil demand. You can also see, and this is a bit zoomed in on the second figure, that the average fuel consumption, so the efficiency of cars, is to increase. So the average fuel consumption per 100 kilometers is to decrease over time. And last, you can see how the imports of gasoline, of oil products, are to increase, and what is the subsequent import dependency. So here, what's interesting is to see how the parameters and the hypotheses we took can reflect and can impact those end results. So for example, if we assume that energy efficiency is higher, if we assume that, for example, the government will take stronger measures to put out of the roads the oldest cars, that the government will prevent importing second-hand cars which are older than 15 years or which are above a certain level of energy efficiency, we could have higher energy efficiency improvements per year. So let's assume that instead of having 1% improvement per year, we have 3%. And if, on the other hand, we assume that the refineries in the countries will increase faster their outputs, so 4% instead of 2%, then you can see on the, which is a red line, that our import dependency level, which was at 70% by 2030, would remain stable at by 2030 at around 50%. So again, this is a very simplified model, but just to show that making those predictions and taking some assumptions, then we can get some very concrete and very interesting plans and outputs that can really drive policy making. In that case, in the transport sector and in the refinery sector, with energy efficiency as a key parameter to be taken into account. So I'm stopping here, and we'll of course send you the comprehensive Excel with all the calculations so that you can check the results. And I'm looking at questions. Okay, so we have a question on the Excel. So indeed, I think you have only received the handbook, which includes the solutions, but you have not received the Excel sheets with the solution. We will send to you so that you can indeed get all the calculation and see directly the solution. So point well taken. We'll send that to you. So please, any question on the Excel exercise or on the presentation, feel free to write it down or to raise your hand if you want to speak up. And in the meantime, maybe I can add a bit more on the question that was asked before, since Zakia reminds me that when it comes to COVID, so the impacts on our projections are mostly on the short term. As you understand very well, the year 2020 has been dramatically impacted by the COVID in terms of energy demand, in terms of CO2 emission. So our starting point for the predictions was way lower than in our pre-pandemic trajectories. So this is the first impact on the short term of the COVID. And then we have taken different scenario and looked at what the recovery shape could look like, depending on how governments and how the world will be able to handle the pandemic and its consequences. But for sure, the main impact is on the short term, with something like a 5% increase in energy demand in 2020 compared to 2019, which was something we had not seen. That was a shock, the biggest shock over the last 70 years. And our latest, to continue on those short-term perspective, our latest analysis show that in 2021, energy demand is expected to rise very sharply, to increase significantly, and this is very bad news. CO2 emissions are rising again. So this would mean that the year 2020, which was in which we observed a significant drop in CO2 emissions of around 7%. This year might not be a peak, because in 2021 we are in a trajectory where CO2 emissions would increase very, very high. This year would be the second highest year in terms of annual increase of CO2 emissions. So the IEA is again trying to provide significant and very detailed analysis on this, as we all aim to be on track and to be aligned with the Paris Agreement trajectories to reduce CO2 emissions very quickly, and to levels which would able to limit global warming. So one question on the exercise, which are what consideration we took to set the parameters in our assumptions. So this is really a fictitious exercise with data which are not real and not coming from specific countries. It was more to explain the rationale behind. So there are some very rough estimation and simplification. One example I can give is on the rate we took the parameter for passenger kilometers. So we assume that it will increase in the future by 7%. And this comes from what we observed in the past. So if we look at question 1, we calculated how passenger kilometers evolved over the last 2 decades. And if we look at the very last years, I think if we look at the last 10 years, or the last 5 years, the average increase of this parameter was at around 7%. So we just choose to apply the same growth rate in the future. Again, this is super simplified. Tomorrow in the session on building, we'll try to do more accurate and more detailed projections to try to see how energy demand could evolve in the future for to meet cooling needs in the residential sector. And here we'll have several ways of estimating those variables, and we will more specifically try to rely on proxy variables that will be detailed tomorrow. Okay, so again, one specific question on hydrocarbon that I invite you to keep for Monday. There is one question from Mr. Joshua on uncertainty analysis. So I'm not sure I perfectly get the question. We do a lot of well, uncertainty are at the heart of any energy modeling exercises. So what's very important is when we make projections, when we develop a world energy outlook or any analytical book, it's important to highlight what the uncertainties are, because it's not about predicting the future. It's about saying, if those conditions are observed, this would be the consequence, this would be the impact for the energy sector. So for example, in the latest World Energy Outlook, again, we really stressed on that the fact that we don't know, there is no certainty on when the pandemic will be over, when there will be a return to normality for the transport sector. So we have done a lot of variations and cases to try to reflect what these uncertainties would be. So just in short, we deal a lot with uncertainties, and we aim to be transparent on what we don't know, what we assume, so that the results can be taken into that context. And for your question on the Monte Carlo, I'm not sure I get it. So if you want to specify it more, happy to elaborate more. So tomorrow we'll meet again at the same time, 9 a.m. Lusaka time, to enter much more into details of how to make projections of future energy demand, and we'll illustrate that by looking at the building sector. So building means residential plus services, and we will have a specific exercise on cooling needs and what these cooling needs would entail for demand for electricity to power AC units. So we'll really take all the steps we discussed today, looking at the drivers, at the useful energy demand, and then at the total energy demand. So if there are no more questions, I would like to thank you very, very much for your participation today, your attendance. And if you have any other question, please send them per email. We'll be happy to answer. If you have questions on the Excel exercise and the calculation, please also send per email. And looking forward to talking to you tomorrow morning. Have a good day all.